telling me about this a year and a half later, all remembered how angry they were. Get him out of here. Get him out of here. They didn't want to hear this. And anyway, I obviously went looking for him. What a story. It took me a long time. We didn't have internet then. I remember I was in Salt Lake City calling various, I knew he was from Indiana. I knew how to spell his name. I finally found the house, town called New Goshen. I flew overnight to Chicago, and then New Goshen's below Indianapolis, which is below Terre Haute, which is below. Anyway, it took me forever, and I finally found this house. And here's this old ramshackle chicken farm. Chickens all over the place, no man clearly around. And I had spoken to Milo's mother the night before, and she said, well, I don't know what he'll do. And I said, I'll be there the next day. And I show up, and she comes out to greet me. She's maybe 50, looks 70. Everything's in disrepair. And I said, I wanted to see her son. She said, he's in the house. And I said, may I go? And she said, I don't know if he'll talk to you. And then this woman, this sort of uneducated, very rural woman from on the banks of the Wabash River in the very south of southern Indiana, she looked at me and she said, very angry and very low, she said, I gave them a good boy, and they sent me back a murderer. And you know, you hear those stories, and I'm right there. It's a moment you'll never forget, and no matter how much I write about it, I still think about it. And we're just hearing it today, all day, again and again. And the bottom line is, this is what war is.
Seymour Hersh, what about Larry Colburn? What about the guys who came down in the helicopter to try to stop this?
They did try to stop it. They jeopardized their career. They actually drew their weapons, which was quite amazing. And they did stop in the short term, they stopped the slaughter of a bunch of women and children who had taken a refuge in a cave or in a complex, in an underground complex. And they did stop them from being shot immediately. I don't know whether they were shot eventually or not.
What do you mean they drew their weapons? They drew their weapons on their fellow soldiers?
Yes. The machine gunners turned, he was a door gunner, machine gun in a chopper. And they pointed them at their fellow soldiers, absolutely. Other soldiers in the unit, I think there were about 80 guys that went in, and I think I must have, in the next 6 months, talked to 50 or 60 of them. And there was a racial distinction that was interesting. I don't know. It seemed to me, just on the basis of those I talked to, very rough, that the vast majority of the African American and Hispanics shot, but shot high. It was just, you know, it was the white boys' deal, they thought. They were afraid not to shoot because they were afraid of getting a bullet from their fellow soldiers if they did not shoot. So they shot. And so you did have occasions. There was differentiation. Not everybody was an automat like Milo and shot every time an officer asked them to. There was distinctions. And Coburn and Thompson and the others, but they were waved off. Everybody was exceedingly angry at Thompson. When he got back, he was chewed out, you know, for being unprofessional, et cetera, et cetera. And Thompson, at one point, took a medal that talked about his bravery. It was sort of like he did do it. He was sorry he did it later. It was complicated because those who behaved correctly were the ones who were in the wrong in terms of what was going on that day.
Seymour Hersh, Gareth Porter did a piece at antiwar.com, My Lai probe hid policy that led to massacre. The whole issue of this being described as some kind of rogue operation that had no official sanction. And he said for decades it was accepted that the massacre by Army troops was a violation of official policy directives. That the conclusion reached in the most definitive account of the My Lai massacre, the final report by General William Peers, who investigated the question of responsibility in 69 and 70 for the Army. Documentary evidence from U.S. Army archives shows, however, Peers' report misrepresented a key directive from the top commander in Vietnam, General William Westmoreland, describing it as a calling for a blanket policy of humane treatment of civilians. Gareth Porter says the directive made it clear the U.S. military command's policy was to consider the civilian population in long-term communist base areas as the enemy, which could be subjected to the same treatment as communist military personnel. The Peers report description, which avoided quoting directly from the document, effectively covered up the actual intention of the command's policy toward non-combatants in places in My Lai. Directive 525.3 is not the only piece of evidence pointing to a military command policy of treating non-combatants in Viet Cong base areas as subject to indiscriminate violence. In his own memoir, General Westmoreland himself wrote, once the free fire zones were established, anybody who remained had to be considered an enemy combatant, and operations in those areas could be conducted without fear of civilian casualties. Your response?
Look, I spent a lot of years looking at it, and I can tell you the notion that this was in any way justifiable was just not brought up. There may indeed have been a piece of paper like that. You know what I mean? I can tell you that when I was doing the Abu Ghraib stuff in the New Yorker 3 or 4 years ago, afterwards there was all this talk about Army regulations, about what's right and wrong, and I can tell you that when I learned about Abu Ghraib 5 or 6 months before I could write about it, just because you had to get evidence. Nobody ever mentioned the word regulations to me. In other words, the whole notion that there were regulations of what you could or could not do. In the case of the Iraqi war, there was no limits on what you could do to prisoners, just don't get caught. In the case of the Vietnam, the only problem with Gareth Porter is a good reporter. I've known him for many years, and he certainly knows Vietnam better than anybody. He wrote a lot of great books about it back 2 or 3 decades ago. But in this case, it just never came up that there was any justification. Indeed, there were areas in free fire zones in which anybody who they would go, and the American position was we would say to people who have been farming in this area for, who knows, 1,000 years, their families, and suddenly declare it a free fire zone and offer them a chance to live in some prefabricated housing that we were building. And anybody who chose not to go was considered suspect, theoretically. But there was also a common sense approach, which was, in this case, there was no enemy combatants, there was no shooting, there was no opposition. Everybody understood this was just sheer, random, violent murder. So I don't think, without disagreeing with what he says, because I simply don't know, that defense was never raised at any point, that there was any justification. I would think. But then
yes. The bigger point that this My Lai was not isolated. The idea, you know, the Toledo Blade reporters who've done this remarkable job talking about the dozens of My Lai massacres that have never been documented.
They're just, but to take what you're saying to its logical extension, essentially, the argument would be that anybody could shoot anybody at any time. With, you know, there would be there was just no laws at all. And clearly, here in the case of My Lai, everybody knew something wrong had happened. There were immediate investigations, and it was covered up. But it was considered scandalous and shameful upon subsequent investigation. Everybody knew a grave mass crime had been committed. And that doesn't, of course, and Piers, I was very critical in the stuff I wrote, not only in the eventual books and stuff I wrote for the New Yorker back in the early 70s, very critical of Piers, because it turns out another unit of the same task force to which Charlie Company was attached, it was called Task Force Barker, I think there were 3 companies, they ended up killing over 100 people, innocent civilians, in a village a couple of miles away or less, Mi-K 4 or Mi-K something, whatever it was called. And so clearly you had a pattern of very wild, indiscriminate fire, like we just heard in the winter in your earlier broadcasts, soldiers just shooting randomly at cars. But it's just, I just have no evidence that I've known about that you could simply go into a village and shoot indiscriminately. You did. It happened often, but it was always considered to be a crime. And this was certainly considered by everybody at the time to be a crime.
Your reflection now, as you hear an excerpt of Winter Soldier, will be doing these hearings all week on this 5th anniversary. No corporate media coverage of this weekend. Remarkable gathering of hundreds of active duty soldiers as well as veterans describing their own experiences, echoing back to '71. The Winter Soldier hearings of Detroit, Michigan almost got no coverage as well at the time.
You know, I'm somebody who works in the straight press. I worked for the New York Times for 9 or 10 years in Washington, doing a lot of good stuff. And I'll tell you, I've been reluctant to come to it, but I have to tell you, the Main Street press in this administration, they've failed the First Amendment. Jefferson would be turning over in his grave. They've missed the great moral story of our time, which was the inadequate facts on which the president went to the war, extended the war from Afghanistan into Iraq. They've missed this complete. This is a presidency that, you know, we have a president that uses words that, you know, we don't torture.
We'll have to leave it there.
The economy's going great.
Seymour Hersh,
well,
thanks for joining us. Our website,
sure.
democracynow.org, where you can get a copy of today's show. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.